Thanks, Brian. Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Thursday, November 14th, 2024. We'll do roll call. Joe Murphy, Susan Axelrod, Peter DiStefano, Robin Peltier is absent, Liz Clark, Caper Wilson here, and Maria Mack is here. Our first agenda item is Old Tower Hill Road Neighborhood Study. We are joined virtually by Jason King from Able City East. Good evening. Nice to see you again. I'll let you get started. I think that most of us were at the joint work session with the town council relative to the plan, but we didn't really have the opportunity to interact with you because it was more of a presentation. So I think tonight is an opportunity for us to go over your draft and to ask questions and talk about form-based codes and hybrid models and so on.
Just a reminder before Jason starts, all he can see is the camera image from the back, so he's seeing everybody, not individual people like you see with him. And the only way he's going to hear you is if your microphones are on. Otherwise, he's got nothing. So just remember that. Please.
Got it. Thanks.
And let me just put up the slides and see if this is working. Well, my presentation is up, I believe. Are you all able to see the first slide?
Yes, we can.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present South Kingston tonight. My name is Jason King with Able City. We're working on the Old Tower Hill Road Neighborhood Plan. It was great to see you all during the council meeting, and I appreciate this opportunity to dive in a little more specifics when it comes to the form-based code. So this is sort of a form-based code 202 presentation. During the council meeting, we went very quickly over some slides that covered form-based codes generally. What I was hoping to do tonight is to provide more specificity. We'll talk about what are form-based codes. We'll also talk about form-based code frequently asked questions and case studies. And there were some questions at the council meeting that we can talk about and address. In the spirit of a workshop, it would be great to turn this into a discussion, and you can ask your specific questions. Hopefully you have access to the code and you're able to look at it. We could go through different pages. And if there's time permitting, if the discussion is short, or if things move quickly, then there's another portion of my presentation which is code specifics, and we can do that. Well, as you know, this is our study area. Kingstown Road and Old Tower Hill Road meet in an area which is currently zoned highway commercial. And the Old Tower Hill Road Neighborhood Plan, one of the main implementation items is to adopt a new form-based code that requires street-oriented architecture. This is done by regulating frontages, requiring shop fronts, and identifying unintrusive parking locations. So we talked about this at the last meeting. We talked about how a form-based code complies with the South Kingston Comprehensive Plan. Well, before we started doing this project, the existing adopted town plan called for an amendment of the regulations, especially the commercial highway area, to address standards for building scale, architectural elements, pedestrian access, connectivity, signage, landscaping, and street trees. So hopefully tonight's presentation will hit upon each one of those items. We've all met and I presented to you before, but in terms of our specific, I'll be using material from a number of groups. part of the Congress for New Urbanism and was probably the New Urbanists that invented form-based coding. I teach at the National Stroud Institute. I'm an AICP certified planner. I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Miami where I teach about traditional labor design and also about form-based coding. And then there's also the Form-Based Code Institute. So this is a group, these are practitioners such as myself. We work around the country and we stay in communication. So a lot of the materials tonight is going to be coming from the Form-Based Code Institute group and my affiliation with them. I'm a teacher, an instructor with the Form-Based Code Institute, and there's several FBCI presentations that I've recorded that are available online. The other important thing, we'll be showing images from a number of spots. We've talked about the books that my firm and myself have contributed to. There's a really great one, Form-Based Codes by Dan Perlich. And Dan Perlich's book features, I wasn't a co-author on this one, but his book features a lot of the projects that I'll be discussing. So 2 additional places to go for information. First, Form-Based Code Institute, and I really do recommend Dan Perlich's Form-Based Codes book. We talked about how form-based codes are different from a conventional Euclidean zoning, from the existing highway commercial zoning, in that form-based codes create a walkable public realm, are regulating the form of buildings, streets, and public spaces. So buildings, streets, and public spaces. Right now, you have a zoning code which talks about uses, and there is regulation of form. There's maximum lot coverages, there's setbacks, there's parking requirements, but the form-based code goes much further in the regulation of form and also gets into the design of streets and public spaces. Last time I showed you an image from here. This is where I am. I grew up in Rhode Island. I go back and forth between New Bedford and South Miami. I've been working in South Miami for 20 years. And our form-based code that we put in place right at the beginning of my time here has gone into effect. I've been able to work at this sort of thing on every side as a planner, as a business owner, as a person that goes to these restaurants. The restoration on Dorn Avenue and Sunset Drive is a case study quite often cited. This was a bleak street. It didn't even have a name. It wasn't even called Dorn Avenue. And as new development came in, or as buildings were rehabbed, which is also very important, they were required to follow the form-based code, and it creates sort of outdoor room, a main street of activity. So form-based codes focus on the form. So right now, your existing commercial zoning districts, your land development regulations, there's 3 parts to it. There's form, the way buildings look, there's use, what's happening inside the buildings, and there's administration. There's how the code is applied, how applicants achieve building permits. And right now, with most codes in the United States, the focus is really on use. And so you have a very long use table. It makes a lot of distinctions between the different uses. Initially, this was very important. It separated heavy industry factories from homes. But over time, this use table became somewhat nitpicky and very, very detailed. And updating the use table is necessary, it's continual. What form-based codes do is they focus much more on form. So there's still the administration piece, but use, as long as the form of the buildings are compatible, the effort in a form-based code is to mix different uses. So form-based codes focus on the pedestrian experience. FBCI, wherever I go to present, I try to take pictures of the places that people like the most. The traditional, walkable, historic, typically, parts of town prioritize the pedestrian because it was on foot, was the only way one could travel, right? And so a lot of people go to Disney World for multiple reasons, but one of the reasons is just because it's a day walking around without needing to drive. So throughout the country, if you think about the places where you vacation, whether it's Nantucket or if it's Austin, You probably are familiar with just one quarter of a much larger city, and that's the walkable district. Now, increasingly, the walkable district is a new area created by a code, and it isn't something that was built 200 years ago. Prioritizing the pedestrian looks like this. Blank walls are not allowed on streets. New buildings are allowed to come closer to the lot line. They're able to use more of the lot from a 30% lot coverage, which means you can only use one third of your site to higher, sometimes a 60% coverage. But in order to do that, the building then needs to present a shop front. And reviving the tradition of shop fronts has been a huge part of the form-based coding effort. In the case of the South Kingston draft form-based code, which is at the back of your master plan, we've also required awnings. Now, a lot of form-based codes go further. In the city of Miami, the street has to be fronted by a colonnade such as this. But we felt, that the awning is sufficient and more contextual to New England. So that pedestrian experience, this is a new development in Montgomery, Alabama. We did a form-based code for the city of Montgomery. This is one of the new developments that came out of the project. And you can see, in this case, the developer is using a lot more of their building. Their parking requirements are lessened. They're able to build commercial in addition to residential. Right now, your highway commercial doesn't allow residential. And what we ask is a great public realm like this one. So sidewalks, street trees, places to dine, shop fronts and faces to the street. A form-based code can easily mark on a formula chain. If one is in place, and the Old Tower Hill Road area is a place where chains are, and it's a place to go for inexpensive, reliable food. And as a college student, I went to the Taco Bell and the Pizza Hut, or the Kentucky Fried Chicken all the time. And it is possible to turn formula change into something that looks more like an urban format. The chains now, the Burger Kings and the McDonald's and the Taco Bells, they have two different off-the-shelf designs that they can use when situating a new establishment or when saying yes to a new franchisee. And if you're not asking for an urban format building like this one, then you're getting the suburban format one, where the building is set back and there's parking all around. Park Avenue, Florida is a project that like South Miami, I've been involved in the ins and outs of every part of this project. I helped design the street, I helped design the buildings, I put in place the groundwork, my team put in place the groundwork code, and one structure after another, it's been in place, it's transformed. So if you're worried about, form-based codes, Google Park Avenue, it's been 21 years of working there, and you can see all the headlines. You can see the discussions and the debates and the controversies created by form-based codes. But there's no way, after 21 years, no one is pulling back on the form-based code. I don't know of any form-based code that has been, in my experience over 20 years, I don't know of a form-based code that has been disregarded or even overhauled to the point where it doesn't work anymore. Once in place, it tends to be very popular. But that's just my experience. Form-based codes also play multimodal streets. So, your zoning code doesn't have even colors. It doesn't have assignments when it comes to Old Tower Hill Road or any of the streets. A form-based code is committed to making complete streets. Part of it isn't safe to have a building close to a sidewalk if it's a 5-foot sidewalk and cars are moving really fast past it. It's not safe to give the development community 60% lot coverage. It isn't safe to allow them to build buildings close to the street if the pedestrians are very close to moving cars. And so you're building a complete street. It's an area for people to dine, a required amount of pedestrian zone where people can pass, trees, lights, benches, ideally bike facilities, and ideally on-street parking, which provides like a long wall of metal which blocks the sound and allows people to eat outdoors. So in the we have these graphics in the plan, and these are graphics that are also in the code. It talks about how street trees are required, awnings, these opportunity zones, street furniture. We didn't require it for South Kingston. South Kingston has been handling street furniture by itself as a municipality. That could be changed. One important part is the sign code. So in the form-based code, the signage changes. The signage is much more oriented to the pedestrian. Form-based codes often allow for things like parklets. Parklet, you've probably seen these before, wouldn't be appropriate on Old Tower Hill Road or Kingstown Road. But on the many perpendicular main streets, the side streets that would be created, mixed-use streets, parklets would be an optimal thing, and your code allows for this, the draft form-based code. There's also allowed lighting if you're asking people to be outside, walking through parking lots that are behind buildings, or to use streets, then there are lighting requirements to keep it a safe environment. So this brings us to another before and after. This is Clematis Street, West Palm Beach. This is a recent redevelopment project for us. We designed every part of the street. We designed all of the buildings. There's the lighting, the new lighting requirements, which create a vibrant, exciting place. In this case, we were very, very detailed in the pavers and the plantings. This level of detail was put in the code, along with a design for the street. And in this case, we created not just a regulating plan, which we talked about, but we identified these different zones where different activity would happen. It doesn't have to be that detailed. The transformation of the public realm really can just have a sidewalk. A sidewalk of 10 feet minimum, sidewalk of 17 feet, sidewalk of between 15 and 17 feet allows for on-street dining. A sidewalk of between 15 and 17 feet allows for trees and allows for light posts, plenty of room for people to pass. Right now, through a lot of the Old Tower Hill Road area, there's either a 5-foot sidewalk or there's none at all. And so, this safe spot for the pedestrian is created, and the public investment is followed by private investment. So what you are seeing there is the form-based code's mixed uses. So right now, the image on the left is a lot like how Old Tower Hill Road works. There's retail, there's office, there are some nice little pocket parks, major intersections, and they're all separated, they're all linear, they're all surrounded by their own parking lots, and it's quite impossible or a lot to ask for someone to walk in that kind of environment. The form-based code seeks to mix these uses and to create a network of streets, of blocks that people can walk. Again, there's a lot more development allowed, but it's actually, development's actually a good thing in an area that's been form-based coded because it fills in the streets and creates long, continuous street walls for people. So a mix of uses. Again, the highway commercial does not allow residential. So it doesn't take much once you start to allow residential. Here we see 3 separated uses. This isn't South Kingstown, but it could be, right? Once you start to allow the mix of uses, residential is very high, as you know, in South County. My gosh, how expensive is it? And so it's a huge incentive to allow residential. if a developer is really going to use an entire site, fill it out to 60% lot coverage, a lot of times a small parking garage would be necessary. In the plan, we show a large parking garage by the shops, but increasingly we see two-story parking decks. Two-story parking deck doubles the developable area on the site. So, this is a whole field of architecture now to create these small parking garages in order to create more space, in order to fill up more sites. Parking garages must be urban buildings, however. So when we think of parking garages, we tend to picture this kind of thing. Covington, Kentucky, our form-based code in Missoula, Montana, require that there be shop fronts along the corner of the major intersection. But ideally, this wasn't us, but I love this parking garage in San Jose, California. Ideally, the parking garage would disappear entirely. Ideally, the parking garage is surrounded by a series of liner buildings, and these liner buildings hide the very existence of the garage. So this is sort of what the San Jose model looks like. You have a couple blocks where this would be large enough to manage in the Tower Hill area. Form-based codes are based on people's preferences. So if you remember, we did the interactive dot exercises, community surveys, so people were placing green and red dots. And the report shows this page. We talked about it during the shred. We talked about so that those images, which were seemingly random, were actually paired. So there's a form-based. So there's a over here. There's a CVS, which is part of the Mashpee Commons development, done by Duane Potter-Zyberg in Massachusetts, and that's what the CVS is required to look like. Without requirements, it's possible to look more like this. There's some McDonald's, and you see these are predominantly green dots. So the images that I'm showing on the left are the images that people liked by far. The report gets into the specifics, but people didn't like this. The Hampton Inn, and they were much more fond of a hotel built with a traditional vernacular, ideally. They were less interested in streets that look like this, and they were more interested in streets that were more multimodal. Form-based codes can be used to densify neighborhoods. So I mentioned this during town council, but I didn't elaborate on it. We are in the draft that we have for you. We are not using the form-based code to densify the neighborhoods. Let me show you what that means. Form-based codes are traditionally, they've been concerned with one thing. Again, it's the public realm, it's space in between. It's the shared area. And so a form-based code would not allow sort of what they call snout houses and would require front porches. So I've done a lot of codes which have done this. So all new houses that have to come in have to contribute to the front porch experience, front porch communities. And that is all that I was doing with form-based codes for a long time. And now the form-based code is changing. Practitioners are using it to add missing middle housing. Missing middle is housing that's affordable to buyers and renters of more modest incomes. It's in the middle. It's not a tower. It's not a single family house. Form-based codes could allow new housing options. We talked about this a little bit. We talked about how you reduce the need for parking lots if you add the number of residents, if people living near Old Tower Hill Road. And the way to do that, the easiest way, is to allow accessory dwelling units. These are the sort of backyard granny flats that essentially double the density on a site. Another option would be to allow duplexes. In the Northeast, our historic duplexes tend to be stacked on top of each other. The new duplexes are side by side, so that way, kids can run around on the second floor and the people on the bottom floor can still sleep at night. So side by side duplexes tends to be what's required by form-based codes. It's also the use of cottage courts. These are small houses. Small houses on small greens without yards, with a common shared yard. Is a cottage court design done by Donald Powers, Union Studio Architects. These are both duplexes and it's a cottage court. So this is tight living. You know, these are small houses, 800 to 1,000 square feet. But it's still a front porch community. It's still a dignified, self-respecting, cool kind of place to live. Form-based codes often allow townhomes, and then small mixed use and live works. We did the coding in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. This building looks like it's old, but it's not. And there are people living above a shop, and that keeps it naturally affordable. This is a historic example, not very far away, in Ocean Springs, Mississippi. And so you can see here, you can mix residential with commercial as long as the commercial is about the same size and about the same shape as the residential. What people are afraid of when you take a single family neighborhood and you allow duplexes or triplexes is this case in Ramapo, New York. What they're afraid of is you don't want to be the house on the right. You don't want a house that's dwarfed by the neighbor. You don't want to, these are incompatible. This is a difficult way to live. So if you just allow, and too many communities are doing this now, knee-jerk reaction to what feels like an exclusionary zoning regime. Anyway, they're just allowing duplexes, allowing triplexes, allowing quadruplexes, and allowing accessory dwelling units, and they end up getting these monster houses. And so that's not good. Anyway, so we didn't go that far. We didn't touch the single-family residential areas that are around Old Tower Hill Road. We colored within the lines, and we stayed within the highway commercial area. So just slow down over here. Will the new code prevent redevelopment by being too restrictive? I want to tell you about, one thing about being a planner. I've put in place a lot of plans in a lot of different places, but it's over years, decades of working in a place that you see what works. And I've been working for decades in Montgomery, Alabama. We did a downtown master plan, similar to the master plan that you have, red for new buildings and green for new greens. At the same time that Montgomery adopted their master plan, they also adopted a form-based code. And the purpose of transects are zoning districts. We'll talk about that. And one of the first areas where it hadn't been required for a very long time. This is called the alley. This was literally an alley in Montgomery in the middle of a block. And the requirements were that there be opacity requirements and lighting requirements and shading requirements. And slowly this area of the alley became one of the cool places in Montgomery where people mix. The energy that happened in the middle of the block, thanks in part to the form-based code, and thanks to a lot of developers very committed to bringing Montgomery back. Anyway, that energy that incubated there, this is a new building that we're looking at, a new Jimmy John's, and this is an alley which pokes through all the way. And we're just having that energy, those people, that money filtered out into Dexter Avenue. Dexter Avenue is the historic Main Street of the American South. And it was a very quiet place. And what's happened is that over $270 million in construction values were invested in the downtown from 2014 to 2021. And this was a New York Times article in which I got interviewed. And I got to know the reporter. And they spent a lot of time. They did a good job quantifying. There's difficulties with the code. There's questions about barbershops and about signs. There's people that want to put up murals that aren't allowed. There's people that want to just create hotels surrounded by parking. There's no way around it. Like, it's a conversation back and forth between the community, between the city of Montgomery and the development community. But so much has happened, and no one has been talking about repealing the smart code that was put in place. So will new code allow buildings that are out of scale? A lot of times form-based code is associated with cities. So I talk about, the other night I talked about two places, Ocean Springs, Louisiana, and I'm sorry, I talked about, this is Hammond, Louisiana, the other place that adopted the master plan and adopted the form-based code. And it was Abita Springs, Louisiana, right next door. They only adopted the master plan. They did not adopt the form-based code. And so we translated the zoning map into, looks very similar, but there's the purples of a mix of uses. And so this is the kind of development that's been coming up. So this plan's been in place maybe 10 years or 15 years. Very slow growth in this part of Louisiana. But this is a proud new building. It's code compliant. It's got the storefronts. It's got parking in the back. There's actually affordable housing attached to this structure. The developer rebuilt this street. You see the new sidewalks. You see the new street trees. They got so many more residential units than they would have had to. So that allowed them to hire an architect who did an excellent job. And so one by one, Hammond, Louisiana is infilling with these urban format buildings up to the sidewalk, and it's fun to follow, how new developments coming in. Look, the size of these structures, 3 stories, is the same as the size of the historic structures. You have the ability, of course, to control the height, the density, the intensity of structures to make sure that it is contextual. This isn't to say, we did work on the plan for Columbia Pike, Virginia, and a form-based code there. That's different, right? They decided to go much higher, to build much bigger. I'm doing a form-based code in Macomb County, Virginia, not very far away. It's going to change a mall into a 10-story residential area. And that's the height that made sense to them. That's the height that they decided on. Columbia Pike is at 10,000 units. And it had a real commitment to affordable housing. That's another thing we didn't do. So you're giving the development community new rights. You're increasing property values. There's no way around it. So the question is, how much do you ask of them? In Columbia Pike, Virginia, a very, very hot market. This is the road that leads to the Capitol building. And they were able to ask a lot. So they weren't just asking for storefronts and awnings and street trees. They were also asking for a commitment to creating affordable housing. If you go too far with what you're requiring from developers, then you could stall a place. So our code for South Kingstown is not currently asking for affordable housing. Well, that's still an open question. And so most of these pictures from elsewhere are their municipal form-based codes in New England. And we talked about this the other night. Yes, absolutely. So growth is slower in the Northeast. The population doesn't grow like it does in Texas or Virginia or California or Florida, these other places where we tend to work, where it's an emergency to put in place these codes. And growth happens fast. So in the Northeast, God bless it, this is what we love about it. It's much slower growth. And nonetheless, those form-based codes, there are many form-based codes adopted in New England. The top list are ones that are wholesale. The entire town adopted the form-based code. Below is places where form-based controls were part of a code update. I was part of several of these. And in thinking about this list, it occurred to me that pretty much every code update, anytime the community changes their code, updates, improves, upgrades their code, there's always going to be now form-based code elements. Even if it's not a new urbanist or someone from the National Shore Institute or someone from the Form-Based Codes Institute, even if it's a conventional engineering firm asked to update the code, there will always be form-based code elements now. It's just a question of what and to what scale. And a little bit more on this topic, the form-based code creates variety by creating different zones, different transects. You see that the T5 urban center is denser, and then there's a general urban area, the T4. That's where we stopped in South Kingston. All we needed was essentially a T5 and a T4. We didn't go as far as the T3 suburban zone or to regulate it even further. All that's necessary in a commercial infill situation is usually the T5s and the T4s. In terms of like the New Englandness of it, you know, I grew up in Bristol, Rhode Island, across the bay, and you know, you can see that these form-based codes are based on historic places like Bristol. You know, the downtown, the Main Street, Oak Street in Maine. You know, it looks like the T6, T5, all the metrics, the setbacks, the heights, the opening requirements. These are all the things form-based codes were created studying places like Bristol, Rhode Island, or Wakefield, Rhode Island. You know, so there's the denser area. There's housing which is attached, or duplexes. There are small single-family houses, and then there's diversion of building density in one area. There's a green space. This is the way we built for a very long time. Jamestown, Rhode Island adopted a form-based code for the entire community, and they used every one of the transects. So farm areas are being protected by their form-based code, for instance. And it's also where you really see change is along the main street of Jamestown. So the building on the top left is relatively new, the last 20 years. Form-based code was adopted in 2007. Sandy Sorling, who's a friend and someone I work with quite often, we're both on the Transect Code Council. We work on a code called the Smart Code, which is a base code. She lived in Jamestown, and so this is an early adopter of form-based coding. And the buildings are coming in, and buildings are being rehabbed in a way that's very much protecting Jamestown's character. This brings us to the question of can form-based codes regulate style? We talked as part of the charrette how South Kingstown is a mix of styles, right? Pretty much every American historic style is present in a place as old as South Kingstown. And we talked about how popularly people tend to understand two, and they're lumping a lot of different styles together, but two things were in there in our conversation. People talked about loving coastal architecture, and of course, I mean, this is all kinds of stuff, right? There's the salt box, there's a Victorian, there's a neoclassical structure. My point is that people talked about coastal architecture, and then people talked about mill building architecture. As a mill town, Peacedale area, Wakefield area, it's a whole different aesthetic. It's the brick aesthetic instead of the lighter wood. It's the darker colors instead of the colors that you're finding on a seagull. It's a whole different, the towers and the cupolas and the pitches of the roofs, the lintels and the sills, everything is different in the mill architecture. And we talked about how you know, a spot like the corner of Kingstown Road and Old Turtle Road could be developed in what's again colloquially known as the coastal style, you know, which is a mix of Victorian and Federalist, and a few other things, or it can be developed in more of the mill style, which is, you know, time revival, Spanish revival. Anyway, and we talked about how it would be important for South Kingstown to allow both. As long as there's a unity within the single project, your form-based code, if you choose to get into the style question, should probably allow both. And yes, form-based codes can very much set a style. So I'm going to go quickly through them. You see the T numbers, the transects, and it's the same formula as in Bristol. There's the dense area, there's the attached units, there's the single-family houses. So dense area, attached units, single-family houses, and then there's the open area. And what you're going to see in these pictures, though, is entirely new construction. So this is all new. It looks like it's been there for a long time, but it hasn't. And so Baldwin Parks looks different. It's an Orlando, sort of Florida, Mediterranean style, kind of. In Newtown St. Charles near St. Louis, it's a brick industrial wrought iron, ties to the vernacular of New Orleans. The Waters has a very different style. This is the sort of the low country Alabama vernacular, but it's the same formula. They're allowing all of these same uses. So what I'm getting at is as long as the building functions in the way that we're looking for, the style really is academic. The important part is that it be creating a walkable lifestyle, a place where people can live, work, and play, and we're not creating cookie cutter subdivisions of any kind. And so, half of my clients are developers. I've said that, and we've done whole new communities working with developers, which have a single style, and the style in Charleston, South Carolina, of course, is very different than the style in Oklahoma City. So, a lot of success stories. Is the public involved in form-based coding? Optimally, yeah. Some communities, I'm working in Winter Garden, Florida right now. We did a charrette, they created the master plan. They do not feel that it is necessary to bring the public together again. That's another open question. But in other places, we do. We explore, we work with the public. More hands on the pond, the better, we say. We do more community image surveys. We do much more specific kinds of community image surveys where people are identifying the specific buildings they like in their own communities with red and green dots. We go into these areas, we say, show me your best, essentially T5 or show me your best T4. And we study, we record all of the setbacks and the building coverage. And it's a very, very close duplication of what existed historically. We work with the public in order to create a DNA for the place that's entirely, totally based in the place. And we work with the public to draw, these scenarios so they can understand how it works. The form-based code that we have at the back of your master plan hasn't been calibrated and tailored to that degree. But in general, it's good classic New England urbanism. All right, well, we haven't shown any pages yet from the South Kingston Code. And we could do that as the second part of this presentation. But I think right now it'd be a good idea to open it up to discussion if possible.
Yes, I was thinking that as well. Do board members have questions? Go ahead, Joe.
Hopefully you're able to see me.
Yes.
Yes, now I'm able to see you.
So a couple times you mentioned.
Before we go further, do we have any questions or any comments?
Can you hear me, Jason?
Jason, can you hear me?
And Brian, you're muted, so if someone is trying to talk to me, I can't hear them.
Jason, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
So a couple times you had talked about some streetscaping or perhaps some places for people to sit, eat. You said that it wasn't necessarily appropriate for Tower Hill Road, but some of the surrounding streets. I guess what we want to know is when you came and looked at the community, do you have an idea of which streets we should be targeting to kind of expand this base?
Yeah, so what I meant to communicate was that Tower Hill Road doesn't need to be cobblestoned, right? It needs to move a lot of cars. It's a 4-lane road. It doesn't, it's a bike trail now, it's a bike lane now. So it's 2 lanes and 2 repurposed lanes with a bike trail. What I'm getting at is I don't think we need to get between the curbs. I don't think we need to do anything in that space. The Department of Transportation did a fine job. So I don't think we need to look at to redesign Old Tower Hill Road. I think it's everything, on the other side of the curb. I do believe there needs to be wider sidewalks, street trees, plantings. There needs to be buildings up close. So Tower Hill Road would very much get the treatment on the private side. I just don't know that we need to go into the middle. I think a lot of designing has already been done there. Is that clear up by?
Well, yes, to some extent. But I mean, essentially, South Kingston is, at least the downtown, is kind of a crossroads, right? We got Tower Hill Road, and we got 108 going in the other direction. Then the streets that come off of that, there's really no business, no pedestrian base at all. And I'm wondering when you look at the community, whether you walked around maybe some of those other side streets and have an idea of, besides Tower Hill Road and 108, what other streets should we be targeting?
So if you're right, it's a crossroads, and 108 and Tower Hill Road are very big roads. And so in order to create a tight little main street, so what you do is you target the perpendicular streets. So let me show you one. Let me see if I'm able to show my screen again. Everything that's perpendicular, everything that meets a 90-degree angle, could become a great street, like Dorn Avenue, one of the streets that I was showing. Okay, so in this case, here's Kingstown Road, and here's the Midas Place, and here's, I think it was a restaurant or an office, and then looking down that way, you see the spot used to be the nursery. I think maybe still is the nursery. So this is the spot where you could create a great tight street. This looks residential, but this could be commercial, right? So essentially what we'd be doing is we'd be turning what's parking lot access, driveways, into streets. And now you have, you have commercial on both sides, potentially. That kind of thing. Yeah, so, one building after another, and the perpendicular street we see here could be something. The other thing is, if a site like the Wakefield Mall area was redeveloped, a lot of new streets would be created. There's now 3 perpendicular Main Street possibilities in a case like this. This is where we want the street to create a tight outdoor room of pedestrian activity. Old Tower Hill Road still moves 20,000 cars a day, but these perpendicular streets here and here, and actually there's 2 here. Actually, but then there's one right here. We'd be creating another one here. These are the streets where we really have to get the design right, and create main streets like you see in downtown Wakefield.
Other questions from folks? Go ahead, Susan.
Hi, this is Susan. You showed us a pretty bleak streetscape in Florida, and then afterwards a pretty shocking change in that. Can you just tell me what the steps are where you've identified that space and you have vision? How much of it is a public partnership? How much of it is helping the right developers? What are actually the steps that you would use to transform that old street into that vision that you had?
Yeah, so we call, we talk about public-private partnerships. So the public would be working on the street in terms of the curb to curb, where cars are traveling or bikes are traveling. The developer would be building sidewalks. In order for our community to find money for that, what we're doing is we're creating complete streets. So there's a federal project, and Rhode Island gets money, and if we come up with a good plan for a complete street, there's essentially federal transportation money that the town is then eligible for, can compete for, in order to rebuild that street. There's ADA monies, American Disability Act monies. And then the plan talks about local ways of tax capture. So what I'm getting at is the town would rebuild a portion of the road, the developer would be responsible for another portion. The developer is responsible, of course, for the buildings, and everything is happening in sync. So with a town with a small tax base like town of South Kingston, we probably would rely on Department of Transportation funding for some of these transformations, just as you saw on Tower Hill Road. Just as Tower Hill Road got those bike lanes, there was a plan, there was a design. Similarly, we'd be going for funding for other streets.
Sorry. So both of the streets that you're talking about are state-owned streets that I think we essentially don't even have control over those roads. They don't belong to us. And so when you're talking about widening the sidewalks to 7 feet and adding street trees, we as a town are then lobbying the state to do that for us? Like, I don't understand. If they're state 108 and Tower Hill Road are state roads, what is our town rights and our buy-in for this changeover?
So the developer, right now, developers have setbacks. There's an area where they can't build, right? What you're saying to the developer is, in that setback, you cannot put parking, and you must build the sidewalk. So even though Tower Hill Road is a state road, a new sidewalk would be created on privately owned land. So I'll show you an example of that. And that's how it gets redone. You do not need the state's permission to work outside of the right-of-way, outside of the land that the state owns. We're asking the developers, we're giving them a lot, and we're asking them to build great sidewalks. So,
Just to add to Susan's question, one of the things that has been noticeable is that probably many of the streets in your slides are state roads. So there must be a means by which some kind of an agreement or negotiation occurs between the state and the community. I noticed that many of the transformations also involve underground utilities. So is this a common, there must be some kind of mechanism that has been successful?
Yeah, that's right. It's a good point. So in this case, right, I go back and forth. Looking at it, the transformation is including right of way. The transformation, there's a broken down sidewalk over here. Sometimes we would stay completely out of the right of way. This area where this car is, that's where the new sidewalk would go, and that would be built by the developer, private sector. That would not need coordination with the Department of Transportation. But I see that here in this transformation that we're developing the sidewalk. Well, that would require coordination with the Department of Transportation. Yeah, and you're right. And then what also is happening is utilities are going underground. Power lines are being moved. Yes, all of that would require coordination. So let's see. Let's look here. Yeah, so in this case, when we go from, in this case, in Clematis Street, when we went from a 5-foot sidewalk to a 10-foot one, this is happening in the right of way. All I'm going to say is that a lot of times that kind of coordination is impossible, to be honest. And so we stay out of the area that's owned by the state, and we work entirely within the area that's owned by the property owner. But nevertheless, yes, we could go through 100 examples of cases in which public-private partnerships worked and great streets got built.
Can you explain what opportunity zones are and how they're defined or generally brought forward?
So there's a federal program, the Opportunity Zone program. If private developers invest in these areas, then there are enormous tax benefits. I'm not sure if your area qualifies as an opportunity zone. Do you know? Is it potential opportunity zone?
I think I've heard the term used in certain parts of the state, but Brian, do you know if there's?
I don't know a lot about the program, but my gut reaction is this area probably would not qualify, but it's worth research, definitely.
I think there were some adjacent to URI a few years ago, but I'm not sure where the program is at this point.
Usually it's a lower income area. There's probably areas in Peacedale, that would qualify. If you don't qualify for a federal program like an opportunity zone, then the plan talks about other ways of creating money. It talks about tax increment financing, which essentially is raising money that stays within your area. This is legal in Rhode Island. Or community redevelopment area. This is also legal in Rhode Island. These are essentially local programs that keep tax money that's created, additional value that's created, and it keeps that money within this study area. And that's what is often used to rebuild streets, to put in light posts, or put infrastructure underground. The South Kingston use, are there any TIF areas currently?
I don't think the town has used that model in the past, so that would be something new here.
A couple more questions. You said that many of these projects initially are based on people's preferences, and you have seen what works over the decades. So is there a nexus between those two?
Yeah, good question. We would have to, the nexus, right? The rational nexus. You're using Supreme Court language. In order for government to do anything, it has to make the case that this thing is necessary and that this thing is necessary. The rational nexus between what you're doing and what needs to be done. We need to make the case. So if we were going to do something like, form-based coding, you don't need to make the case that the community already regulates zoning, it regulates setbacks, it already has this power, and it's already using it. To go further, though, if we start to regulate style, then we have to establish that the public is in favor. We've got to work with the development community. We've got to work with the property owners. Because when you start to regulate style in a municipality, you can create legal liability if you haven't created enough, if you haven't made the case. So yes, talking to people, making the case, and creating creating a style guide that also has some flexibility. All that should happen. So a lot of communities it doesn't happen, but all that should happen.
My last question is, with regard to the architecture, it's interesting the way that you demonstrated when you changed something to 3 or 4 stories, how it's well designed in that in one of your first slides you showed sort of this plain yellow building, and then you divided in half horizontally, then you added signage, then you added a shop front below, and it completely changed the look and feel of the mass and scale, that kind of initial blank yellow wall or building.
Yeah, that's right. With density, you need design, and this is the way they used to build. So buildings used to have a bottom, a middle, and a top. Buildings used to be divided into bays, which had vertical proportions, because humans like vertical proportions. We anthropomorphize architecture. The traditional architecture creates a face. And if the face looks like a robot face, then people don't like it. There's ways in architecture, what's called the architecture of community. There are ways, traditional ways, that you see and that have taken big masses and broken them down into much smaller pieces and made it much more palatable and given the pedestrian, given the world a much better experience. If we just build 4-story boxes with blank walls, then it's an awful environment. Good point.
Thanks. Liz?
Hi, this is Liz. Excuse me, I have a question. You just mentioned an expression, regulate style. How does one go about in a planning board situation or any town regulatory situation? How do you regulate style? We're so opposed to that at this point. I'm curious how you approach that.
Yeah, so this is another open question, right? This is another point of discussion. In the form-based code draft that you have, there is some style. It talks about vertical proportions. It talks about buildings having a bottom, a middle, and a top. It's the simplest basis, or rather, it's the sort of the first step in that direction. It's stuff that is easy to regulate and easy and not, it's objective, and it is not subjective. That's as far as we went. We did not start talking about the picture roofs or the kind of windows or even materials. We didn't talk about the style of a cupola or the color of an awning. Right now, what you have does not go there. Just because I don't know that you want to, and it would require more work. It's a good point. You're making it, it's hard to regulate. Right now, objectively, your draft code, anyone who administers a code of any kind can communicate what you're looking for. If we start to go down the style road, you're right, it's going to get harder, it gets trickier, it gets more subjective. You get into the same spot that you're in, that everybody's in with historic district commissions and certificates of appropriateness. Everyone loves the historic district, but it's difficult to make judgments. And so make no mistake, if we go down the style path, it does get tricky. But I will tell you that there are many, many, many places that regulate style. And they have less precedent, they have less at stake than South Kingstown.
Thank you.
Any other comments? Peter, John?
I think I mentioned at the town council meeting again. I think I'm just curious, or I'd love to dive into what triggers this, right? We talked about like 50% room or substantial improvement. I think it's really important to not burden existing people to do projects to their building to have to then meet all these new requirements. So that's the piece that I just would love to dive into more at some point and just understand how to quantify that.
Yeah, that was a really good point. I wrote that down. I looked at your existing regulations. I looked at the recommendations in the form-based code. It's still up for debate. We are not clear enough on how that value, that substantial modification is quantified. We're not clear on if it's the value of the property or the value of the building or the value of the location. So you're right. The devil's in the details, and that is a detail we need to work out. Because what we can't do is make it impossible for small businesses to fix up their facade or add it to their dining room. We can't make it impossible for small businesses to make small improvements.
Other comments? No? Let's continue on.
Okay, let's do this. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the slides back up, and we're going to talk about the specific parts of your code. And I think that you should stop me at any time, and we can talk with specifics. Because what we're going to do now is kind of go page by page. I'm just waiting for the PowerPoint to come up. Not yet. Let me try that again. There we go. Right. So this is what the draft form-based code looks like. So there's the different parts. There's the introduction. This is sort of the nexus. It talks about how this is tied to the goals and the purposes of the plan. And there's this form-based code districts. We talked about how we left room for, we have T6, we have T5, we have T4, and we even have a T3 area, and we'll go into it in a minute, but it's not all the distinctions you sometimes find in a form-based code. There's a list of permitted uses. There are the general standards. This is site standards, parking standards, lighting, landscape. There's the building type standards. This is very, very specific to South Kingstown. I'll talk about this. There is the part about streets, like we talked about. The codes get into streets. And then there's administration. Now, the administration, are you creating an expedited process? How does one get a building permit? How does substantial modification work? What is the vesting? What's grandfathered? None of that has been worked out yet. This is all kinds of stuff that you don't need a consultant to work out, to be honest. But if we continue in this path, then these are things we have to work out. I think generally the map is pretty good. Generally the map is some natural distinctions. You have the area really close to Highway 1 to US 1. That area can go quite high. There's a hill. This is the Shaw's area. A lot of incentives would have to be offered in order for this area to be redeveloped. And so that's the T6. Then we get into the T5 area, which is the majority of the project study area. And then there's the T4 area. This is a residential area, a mix of residential and commercial. This is an area where we're not making any changes. And then there's the T3 area. So what I did is we mapped T6, T5, T4, and T3, but we didn't make any changes to the T3 or the T4 area. So what the code has is a regulating plan, the special requirements map. This is the special requirements map. So the red dotted line is shopfront requirements. So if you're redeveloping along this area, and this is Tower Hill Road, and here's 108, and then here's some of those perpendicular main streets we were talking about. If you're redeveloping in those areas, then you're required to put in shop fronts. These, the shop fronts are required. On the bigger roads, you're required to build large sidewalks. So you've got a lot of these things in your existing code, in your existing zoning land development regulation. But you don't have anything like this. You don't have you don't have a special requirements yet.
Jason, that seems to be one of the more difficult concepts, I think, for people to understand.
Yeah.
And is this the same kind of transect model that Tony Nelson did all those years ago on a more urban scale?
Yeah, that's right. Tony Nelson and the visual preference surveys, and Tony Nelson, professor at Rutgers University, New Jersey, hero planner. Absolutely. This is how we design these storefronts, how we require buildings to treat all of that. Yeah, it all builds upon his work. Yep, that's right. Right, so this is the harder part. So, because right now all you're telling these people who want to redevelop is, you're just telling them, they have, I think, a 35-foot setback, stay 35 feet away from the street, and if you have parking in that setback, no problem, and you're only allowed to build on 30% of your site. Some of these sites are over, so, they're probably grandfathered. What we would be asking of them is a lot more. We'd be asking them to build a great streetscape, but we'd also be giving them the ability to double the amount of development. If you look at these little black buildings, it's not very much black, and there's a whole lot of empty, and that empty is all the parking. And that empty is the spot that this areas we'd allow them to redevelop. So the gateway destination areas closer to Tower Hill Road, and these are the higher heights. This is the T6. So the build-to zone, I know you just have setbacks. is different. This is a build to zone. This says the buildings can be no more than 10 feet away from the street. They have to be up to the street. You know. The frontage build out, you don't have this yet. Frontage build out says that they have to build, building facade has to be 80% minimum on the main street and 40% minimum on the side streets. So you're telling them they have, instead of stay out of this area, this 35-foot area, which turns into 50, which turns into 75 on those lots that are so big, we're telling them they have to build right up against the street. And if they redevelop, then there's maximum block perimeters, means they have to create that walkable network of streets. Right now, we only have a 4-story maximum in the T6. You know, it's kind of makes sense. We talked about how you go to historic structures downtown Wakefield, there are only 3 or 4 stories, so we're not going any higher than that. This is the power that allows us the different frontage types, which we'll talk about in a second. Here's the part that says when you have parking, the parking area is set way back. Parking can no longer be in this white area. It has to be from the main streets, has to be set way back. In this case, it's 30 feet. So no parking allowed in the first 30 feet. If you don't do that, then you have what you have, which is parking is the dominant visual image when you're driving down Tower Hill Road. Alright, so we'll get into some of these other ones in a second. The T5 zone, and then so we show these pictures. These are just pictures of I'm going to take pictures of New England forever, and these are just pictures of nice buildings. We could use pictures from South Kingstown. Sometimes you get in trouble with that because it's people owned and people are proud. But so we're not using any pictures from South Kingstown. We're using pictures from other areas. Let's see. This is the use chart. So right now you have a very long, everybody has a very, very long use chart. But like I said, the form-based code is a lot less concerned with use. This actually is another boon to developers. This is another thing you give them because you're asking for other stuff. There's a lot of different uses that would be that would be allowed. And the main ones are these residential permitted uses. You're allowing these new residences. But they have to be of a certain type. It can't just be apartments and parking lots. I lived in 108 Allenwood Apartments. It was apartments and parking lots. It was fine as a college student, but what we're trying to do is build buildings that address the street and the neighborhoods where people know their neighbors. Now, these are the building standards. When I talked about how we got into architecture, but we stayed at a very, very simple level. The building standards talk about how to build storefronts, and it talks about the pieces of windows and the lower, like the bottom level, the middle level, and the top level. Now, we're not saying yet that this can't be modern. So this can all be glass and steel. It could be cantilevered, and it could be. We're not getting into materials. We're saying base, expression line, body, and top, because that harmonizes new development with what you currently have. But we're not telling them these can't be structures built out of other materials. We're talking about how things line up into base, and this is again to create vertical proportions. This breaks down the massing. This creates a feeling of a human scale, even when a building goes up to 4 stories. So this building standards part is as architectural as we get. If you wanted to regulate style, then we would add a lot to this. So these building standards are allowing galleries over the sidewalk, and they're allowing shop fronts. Again, they're not saying that the expression line can't be a metal I-beam. It could be. We're not talking about brick. The parking requirements, one thing that we're doing is we're reducing the parking requirements. Generally, across the country, across the world, the field of urban planning is allowing the developers to we're lowering parking requirements. in the hope that more people are walking, biking, or taking transit. But if not, if people are not walking, biking, or taking transit, our belief is that the private sector knows best about how much parking it needs. It's not going to underpark its restaurant. It's not going to underpark its condominium complex. There are still requirements, but they're much less than you're currently requiring. And then here the building, so the principal building up to the street, required to be up to the street, frontage required, and the parking in the back. These are the building type guidelines. So, these are building types. Now I show a style. I show a traditional style because it kind of makes sense, but these styles are not required. It basically, we're concerned with form, and we don't just want boxes. We want these buildings to have a specific kind of identity and a specific use. The building type guidelines are people are building building types. They're building missing middle building types. We're telling them how to build multiplexes, small multiplexes and mid-sized multiplexes. Now, right now, the building type guidelines are. Let me check this. Make sure. Right now, the building type is not regulatory. Right now, we're not requiring these types. Right now, these are guidelines and not standards. We could change that. You should take a look at the guidelines and see if you want to turn this stuff into law. And we identified these different historic types that existed in these places. We'll just a few more of these. We're talking about how streets have to be different, rebuilding streets, those perpendicular main streets, the curb radius can't allow for cars to fly back and forth around. It's a very tight curb radius. It reduces crossing time. Pedestrians are able to get from one spot to another in less time than if you shave this down to a point where the curb allows cars to move really fast. So curb radius, street design, no cul-de-sacs, building streets need to connect. We're also talking about civic spaces, and this is very much the New England tradition. The squares and the greens and the parks. This is making clear that the required open space has to be designed. It just can't be the remnant of the subdivision process. It can't just be that spot over there, swampy spot. They're actually requiring these civic spaces. We're not requiring very much. The requirement is small, but nevertheless, we're requiring them to be designed. All right, so that was. Is there any page you'd like to look at more closely than what we just went through?
We actually do not have the same draft that you do. I have one from July that doesn't have the code in the back. I'm not sure if folks brought their what they had.
Well, that's okay. Let this be an introduction to it. If Brian, if Jamie are able to make the most recent version available to you, it's kind of it's the reason you don't have it is we've had this process of going back and forth. They've reviewed the plan, they redlined it, we edited it. They haven't had a chance on this code yet. So that's actually, I guess, that's a question for them. Do they want to redline this first? It's customary, it's typical. Staff would go through and then they would send us comments. But it isn't always the case. Maybe it's ready for the planning commission. That's up to you guys.
Any additional thoughts, questions for Jason? Look forward to chatting with you again. I think once we've had time to absorb and understand, particularly the code portion. Obviously, the renderings are wonderful and the transformations are amazing. So those are an easy sell. It's the technical part that needs to be done that takes some time and understanding.
Well, I'm I'm available to do this anytime. I spend about half the year, mostly around spring, summer, and fall, in New Bedford, and it's easy to meet in person. I can do this anytime. You also can contact me. You can send an email to me directly, CC Brian, CC Jamie, but you can send me specific questions as you go through it, and we can make those answers available to everyone. So I hope this is the beginning of the conversation for us, because we do have to get the details right. You need to feel comfortable with this. You need to be the supporters of this. You need to be the advocates for it. And we need to create a document that you're excited about. Because if you're not excited about it, as a planning commission, then we're just not going to have any traction. So I look forward to continuing that conversation.
Great. Thanks very much, Jason.
Thank you, guys.
This is not what was presented to the council. There's more to it than this. This was a draft. And I know I asked Jamie the night of our work session with the council to make all of the slides and the most recent version available to us, but obviously we haven't received it yet. It's difficult yes. And I know that, as Jason said at the meeting with the council, what they presented as far as the code itself was a very generic code that needs to then be tailored to South Kingstown. So clearly there's more work to do. Brian, do you have anything to add to that?
I did ask Jamie a while back about where this stood. I believe the Economic Development Committee was asking about the written proposal that went along with the presentation. And Jamie indicated to me that there were still some edits being worked out at the time, so I'm not sure exactly where it stands now. That was like a week and a half ago.
All right. Well, clearly this is a project that has strong council support. It was enthusiastically received by the public. So I think that the board needs to dive into the details as soon as possible and continue to work on this so that we can move forward and, again, have that customized South Kingstown version.
I'll talk to Jamie when he gets back on Monday and see where he's at on all of this. I would agree in getting it in front of you at the earliest possible opportunity, if for no other reason than looking at this and reviewing this is going to be completely new in comparison to code changes that you've dealt with in the past.
One question that struck me, it's kind of a small point in the presentation, but when he starts talking about filling in some of the spaces with development, whether it's commercial or housing, what are the densities that we're talking about? Because when I started seeing the visuals, it looked like there was a big density increase, and that's going to change the economics of the town. So it's a real side point, but I don't think we need to consider that as we think about it.
And that conversation that has continually occurred about lot coverage and doubling the density, yet this is an area that has the infrastructure, so this is rationale for why this area was chosen initially as for this type of a study project.
But there's also the services that go along with that.
Of course.
It's not just the immediate infrastructure.
Of course, yep. As it is anywhere else in town. Susan?
So I'm trying to understand the logistics of this because we've had two properties change hands recently. One that I saw at TRC yesterday and one that's in the process of being rebuilt, Chipotle on the corner. This is a national chain that's bought a lot and is building their structure in the middle of the lot with the parking around. what's the conversation where we suggest to someone like Chipotle that they put it up on the road, put a couple stories of apartments over the top? Like, that's not their business model. They build one-story restaurants in the old style of strip mall. How do we talk to even the one I saw this week over at TRC about a whole other business model for a national chain that's building their standard footprint? Like, I don't know how to even, do we make them do it? Do we suggest? Do we show them options? Like, how do we get a national chain to rethink their business model with this piece of land in the middle of our town?
I think in a lot of cases, the property is actually owned by a local investor whose swim lane is property and private development, not necessarily, Chipotle. So I don't think Chipotle's your audience. I think it's the local developer who's going to develop the infrastructure and make it suitable for Chipotle to come in on maybe the lower level.
Typically, they're land leases, so that someone owns the land and they lease it to someone else. So, like if Chipotle, for example, whoever owns a piece of land would build a building with apartments above it and say, hey, Chipotle, you can have the ground floor.
Right, but when that restaurant sat there vacant for 2 years, and that restaurant had the deep enough pockets to do something with that land. And remember, somebody came and testified that night, a local business, small business that wanted to use that land, but it was just way too expensive to develop. So that we needed a national chain like Chipotle to do that property. And now we're looking at Bobby G's and People's Credit Union coming in. They're buying a piece of land and developing it to their specifications. How do we transform that business model into this other,
I see what you're saying, but until we have something in place, if there's nothing to steer them toward, I mean, we have to be realistic. We have to be a little more positive about the vision.
I don't mean to sound negative, but I guess I don't know how to transform that idea.
I don't think you're transforming corporate America. I think you're transforming the landowners that see the opportunity, and then they will have Chipotle, CVS, whoever national will say, hey, we have a leased area for you to come and take.
One of the things I brought a bunch of material with me tonight for everybody to look at, and one of them, and this is not super recent, but it's better models for commercial development, ideas for improving design and siting of chain stores and franchises, which is kind of what we're talking about. So I'm going to pass this around, but again, we need to get moving on this and can't do a whole lot about what's happening today, right?
And as Jason pointed out at one point, a lot of these national chains do have alternate designs where they have been required to do something new in other areas. But if you leave your regulations the way they are now, geared toward American strip development, they're going to give you the American strip development. So unless you change the underlying rules, you're not going to push them to do something better.
Do we have more money to keep this group involved, or is it we're out of funds?
The council has indicated that they want to see this through to the point of having the actual zoning code written. So this may be kind of a second phase or whatever you want to call it.
If I recall correctly, the original contract was to generate sort of a basic code so that everybody would get an idea of what this looks like in code form, and that there might be a little bit of an extension required to get it to a full final ready for adoption sort of base.
Other thoughts before I move on, Liz?
I just have one thought in response to what Brian said, that if we don't have regulations in place, we're going to get the strip mall model. But the other thing that we need to think about, and that needs to be in place, is some sort of incentive for this chain. Years ago, I worked on an national Toyota project, and all of the Toyota dealers had to conform to that, archway that they now have, and the red band and all that. And the incentive on that was, you don't do this, Mr. Toyota dealer, you're not getting cars. It was a big incentive. And they all had to do it, and they all had to, each Toyota dealer had to foot the bill. So, you know, money talks. There has to be some incentive for the Chipotles and the CVSs and somebody and the others to want to conform to our regulations.
You know, it's interesting when the first hotel came into South County Commons, what they presented us was exactly what you were talking about, the typical corporate architecture. We spent time with them and basically worked on something that was a unique design specific to South Kingstown, and the end result was so much better than the standard corporate. I mean, you could even look at Dollar General and say that. And we don't have design standards, but we were fortunate that they were willing to try to improve the design and make it more appropriate for South Kingstown.
So the incentive is you want to
You were
come into
fortunate
South.
that they needed a waiver that brought them to the table not to give you their general design, because that's the way Dollar General works.
Yes.
Right. So the incentive is you want to come into South Kingstown, you got to conform.
I think the incentive is the density. That's
Yeah,
exactly
absolutely.
what the incentive is.
The lot coverage, the density, the reduced parking, and so it's trade-offs. Anything else on this before we move on to our next agenda item? So the next one is the 2025 work program. I asked Jamie to add this to the agenda because I felt that it was important that we start talking about it now, because it is November. And he provided sort of a lengthy list that has a lot of staff items in addition to some of the things that we've talked about. But I thought that it would be helpful, even though we have certain things that we already have on our list, such as the Tower Hill Road, the Scenic Roadway, but I thought that we should have a relaxed conversation about different, not necessarily limiting to this list, but just talk about what board members feel that they would like to see in addition to any type of statutory requirements that we all know we need to complete. Brian?
Yeah, just on top of this, which is basically last year's work plan, we still have a lot of catching up to do in terms of bringing our zoning ordinance up to snuff with the last round of legislative changes. And staff is also eager to try and do a fairly substantial overhaul on the subdivision regs, which are getting a bit long in the tooth at this point. And every set of regulations has the same problem. You amend and amend and amend and amend, and eventually they become unwieldy and it doesn't work together as a whole, and you need to sort of go back and restructure it from the beginning. And Jay and I have talked at length about this and worked on a variety of ideas to try and move forward sort of a comprehensive overhaul.
That's great, Brian, and as you probably know, there will probably be changes forthcoming this legislative session that will, again, impact our local regulations, hopefully for the better, but that will require additional time and effort. And as we discussed in a previous meeting, when the word overhaul is mentioned, I think, of course, about the landscaping regulations, and we as a board made the decision that we would like to create a subcommittee and work specifically on those. The landscape architect who is volunteering to help us has not yet been available, so that is why we haven't had a conversation and a meeting about how to begin that process, but he should be available soon. But anyway, ideas from board members. We're not trying to make this unwieldy. We're not trying to give staff a ridiculous amount of things to do, but thinking about the process that we go through, not only in our regular review of projects, but things that we feel should be in the work plan, and particularly those that are in our comprehensive plan. And if you haven't recently looked at the land use element of the comprehensive plan, I suggest that you do so. The land use element, the housing element, the natural and cultural resources as well, because they all are related to one another. And while we can't do everything at once, this is why we have had a works plan in the past. We used to call it the annual action agenda. Then it got changed to the biennial action agenda because we couldn't get everything done in 1 year. But it's good to have a plan. It's good to have goals. And to those of you that have been on the board for a while, this work program is not particularly new per se, but again, there are some things that you could, for example, if you look at the first page of Jamie's document, some of these things are or should be combined, like complete an evaluation of the town zoning ordinance relative to the provision of multi-household development and affordable housing, missing middle, and provide proposed amendments to the town council for review and potential adoption. That, along with continue to evaluate the zoning ordinance, determine whether amendments are necessary to increase clarity, modernize, and bring standards in line with the current best practices, then finalize revisions to the zoning ordinance, et cetera, et cetera. Some of these things are not necessarily separate, but should be combined as a whole. So, again, this was added so that board members could make some suggestions, additions, whatever. This is an opportunity. Joe?
So I'm glad that it has the missing middle, which is about halfway down the first page, and it is also on the last page on the top right-hand side. My idea of this is for it to be kind of complementary with our other changes that we've made, such as the cottage zoning. So it's taken that increased density and making it kind of holistic. So the cottage zoning allows, I think it's 8 units per acre, which is about 5,000 square feet. I think we can go down to a half acre and put like 4 cottages on it. But we haven't seen any of those because I think realistically there's not a lot of land available. And secondly, I think it's unrealistic for somebody to tear down a good structure to put 4 cottages on it. But if we look at maybe allowing some of the existing large houses to be changed into 4 units, I think it becomes a lot more realistic. And it's complementary because it basically would be the same zone, same density as what we've allowed under the cottage. So that's one thing. The other thing that's missing, and I know we've talked about this, I don't know, for years, but I really do believe that there is a lot of opportunity in West Kingston between the water, the sewer, the multi-modes of transportation, the university, and over the last several years, there's been a few houses, I think, that went to either foreclosure or were torn down, and they turned around and put another house up, where I think we should get ahead of it, allow the zoning for maybe a little bit of an increase, maybe some multi-use. For anybody that's been to TLC, it's packed all the time, or at least every time I go in there, it's packed. So the community is right for that setting. So I'd like to see us address the West Kingston and maybe some changes to that zoning.
TLC is, they're well supported by the university students as well. It's a very popular spot.
But it's not just the university. I mean, I see a lot of people that are a little older than the university that's kind of gathering there. And I mean, I saw Susan there. Not that Susan's old, but
Thanks, Joe. Other thoughts? Peter?
I mean, my only thought is I think we just need to pick like two. I think we are always dealing with urgent instead of important, and then people keep developing what we don't want because we can't take the time to, I think it's like this rat race we're in, where we're chasing special meetings, all these other things for individual projects. If we could just take the time to focus on one or two things and get that done for the year, then I think we may start to gain some time. So that urgent versus important, I think, is key.
Anyone else? Susan?
I would just like to agree with what Peter just said, that adding some more ideas to the list isn't getting anything done. And if we keep these on the list, because obviously they're important to us, I'm in favor really of addressing the landscape regulations in this town because I think they're outdated. But I'm also interested, not that we want to add anything else, but in maybe setting up some standards for multi-unit housing projects where we have no standards right now for big development, multi-unit housing standards. I'd like to see some kind of design guidelines with that.
And that fits neatly into it. That's not really an extra thing. That fits into this list, as well as, in my opinion, as well as we've talked about infill and the fact that we don't have, or we have unrealistic or outdated standards for infill, like some of those projects we saw on High Street. We need to modify those so that they're not inappropriate for what it actually is. That includes landscaping.
one, I do agree with Peter and Susan. We should have primary objectives and secondary objectives, and primary objectives should only be a couple. We'll make sure we get those. But the other thing I would say, and I think this is a good segue to it, is that we have all the boards and commissions in the town, and I think that the planning board is kind of should be looked at as a kind of a lead board, and I think we should interact with them a little bit more. A lot of those boards have a hard time holding membership because they don't feel like they're necessarily making a difference. I think we should look at maybe some of these objectives and work with, or perhaps kind of assign. I know we can't necessarily assign, but to the other boards to have them work on some of these things. And, I think we should leverage.
And that's a great point. I think we say that every time we look at some of the language in our comprehensive plan. If anyone watched the work session portion of the council meeting on Tuesday, the Sustainability Committee had an excellent presentation. They demonstrated their knowledge and ability in different fields, and they are having a special seminar on water quality coming up next week. Do you remember the date for that, Brian? It's the Wednesday, maybe? It should be on the town website, and I believe staff has sent out information. It's going to be at the high school at 6 o'clock. I think it's either Tuesday or Wednesday. But that's a great initiative and something that could lead to future collaborative efforts.
That is Tuesday at 6 p.m. in the high school library.
Thanks. So let's then, if there are no further comments, let's go on to any planning board liaison activities. There was this past Saturday, statewide planning had a training for planning board members. Susan and Caper attended. It was well worth the time. They did a mock meeting of a comprehensive permit. And one of the interesting things was that it was meant to illustrate the difference between the previous set of regulations and the ones that we now are bound by. That is currently no master plan for comprehensive permits, possible pre-application and then going right to preliminary. There was a project that was actually done in East Greenwich that would have turned out differently. It had a historic property on the project. So very interesting. Not enough time, I think, for everyone to actually socialize and discuss, but I think they'll be having more of these in the future. So I just wanted to say what a positive thing that was. Anyone else? Scenic Stewardship Plan Committee will be meeting in December. We are moving toward the final draft of the plan, the corridor. Update from planning staff?
So Jamie did not leave me anything about staffing activities or budgeting processes or the capital improvement plan, so I don't have anything to add under that. And he did not leave me the final list of grant awards for the facade improvement program, although I can say that, the applications that were recommended were approved by the council. Despite kind of a bumpy first review, the second review went very smoothly and everything went through.
And there were like 18 of them, right?
Correct.
Which is great.
Yeah, so they've really stretched that money quite a long way, and hopefully it will result in some, highly visible upgrades along Main Street.
Peter, do you have any updates for us on anything legal?
The only thing I'd add is that there is another batch of zoning ordinance amendments that will be coming your way for the latest legislative session. Not as drastic as the last batch that you approved. It's pretty minor in comparison, but those are in the works. You should see them soon.
I know that there was something recently relative to a court decision about rentals.
Yes, there was.
Is that anything you can talk to us about?
I can. So there was a decision out of Narragansett about the short-term rental registration ordinance. Essentially, what was decided was that it was not within Narragansett's home rule authority to pass a registration ordinance. Now, some of the things that Narragansett was doing was a lot more drastic than the ordinance that South Kingstown recently passed. So South Kingstown was just a straight registration. You gave your information, you paid a small fee, and then you could go on with having a short-term rental. Narragansett had a plan to phase out short-term rentals over time. We're going to have a lottery system to limit the number of people that could have short-term rentals. So I don't think it was surprising that that ordinance was struck down. The unfortunate thing was that the reasoning of the judge when she struck it down could potentially apply to other cities and towns. And because we're in South County with Narragansett, the judge that would hear a challenge to South Kingstown's ordinance would be the same judge. What we recommended to the council did, was because it was we were so early implementing the program, we barely collected any fees. We returned the fees, and they agreed that we're going to put a pause on the short-term rental program for now. It was only a preliminary decision from the judge, it's not final, and it could still be appealed, so we just have to wait and see. May not end up being appealed with the turnover in the Narragansett Council. They may like the decision, so we'll have to see what happens.
And there is also a legislative commission that is studying the issue. We'll see if that.
Yeah, my personal opinion on this is that the General Assembly really should pass a statute that allows cities and towns to license short-term rentals and set forth what the parameters are going to be, because there's too much uncertainty around the issue now.
But doesn't Newport have a whole program?
So Newport does it through zoning, which you can do. That was upheld in Superior Court. It's going on appeal, but the appeal hasn't been heard yet. But what Newport said was, in certain zones, you are not allowed to have short-term rentals at all. So that was upheld. They also have registration ordinance, but that hasn't been challenged. And the registration ordinance was fairly limited. They didn't restrict through the registration ordinance whether you could operate. They just required you to file the application, give your information, and pay a fee. But Newport is in Newport County, so they would get a different judge.
So Rhode Island.
Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. If there's nothing else, would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
I'll make the motion.
Susan, second?
I'll second.
Second from Caper. Any further discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.